about all of Star Wars is you don't go to Star Wars comes to you, and that's the best day of your month/year when that happens.
One of my favorite bits is that people come up and say, wow, Walt, what was it like to work on Star Wars?
This is the metaphor I'd say all the time with writing Star Wars. For me, writing Star Wars is like playing the blues. With Star Wars, it's like, you know how Star Wars goes. If I change that too much, it stops feeling like Star Wars.
Was that a fun assignment for you?
I fell crazy mad in love with the Star Wars characters and the Star Wars story, and I was like, oh, I could see so much I can do here.
These days, writers and artists line up to work on a Star Wars comic book. That's how strong a grip the franchise has on pop culture. And with the Rise of Skywalker in theaters, the comics are as important as ever. But there was a time when a Star Wars comic was actually the biggest risk in the industry. The longest of long shots, one that paid off big time for Marvel. From the wacky characters of those early Marvel years to the downright revelatory explorations of the Jedi and Sith religions during the Dark Horse years, comics have served an essential role in expanding the galaxy George Lucas created. And no, it doesn't matter if it's canon or not. Let's go behind the panel on the comics of Star Wars. Hard to believe, but Marvel actually turned down Lucasfilm the first time they pitched a comics adaptation. George Lucas was a big name after American Graffiti, but his idea for an original space opera didn't exactly have Stan Lee seeing dollar signs. It was Roy Thomas who actually convinced Stan to roll the dice on a 6-issue adaptation. It didn't hurt that Lucas let them do the comic book for free. Star Wars the comic wasn't just a hit, it was a runaway bestseller. Written by Thomas and drawn by Howard Chaykin, it was reprinted numerous times, including with a new price of a whopping 35 cents. The title became the first comic book series to sell more than 1 million copies since 1960.
I think what happened, the first issue or two of Star Wars, first couple of issues came out before the movie came out. I don't think they sold that well. When the movie came out, suddenly they had to go back and reprint issues 1 and 2 because it was flying off the shelves. So the comic was doing well.
Then editor-in-chief Jim Shooter credits the success of the Star Wars series with keeping Marvel afloat during 1977 and 1978, when the comics business was in freefall. A turning point came with issue 7, the first one not based on the movie. Marvel made sure to point that out on the cover. It kicked off the very first expanded universe story, and it was a doozy. Putting a galactic spin on the Magnificent Seven, Han and Chewie team up with memorable characters such as Jim Doshin, aka the Star Killer Kid, Don Juan Quixote, yep, you heard that correct, and of course, Jackson, a 6-foot green rabbit, and like Han Solo, a smuggler. The writers and artists simply made it up as they went along, which is why we wound up with gems like a smuggling green rabbit, cyborg bounty hunters, and a floating space station of sin called the Wheel. And how that has never wound up in any of the movies is a criminal oversight by Lucasfilm. One underrated element of that original Marvel series was the consistency with the creative teams. After Thomas and Chaykin left with issue 10, comics legends Archie Goodwin and Carmine Infantino stayed on for 3 years. David Michelinie and Walt Simonson took over from there for nearly 2 years.
Marvel was a smaller company than it is now. Star Wars was just one of the comics they were putting out. A friend of mine, Alan Milgram, may have been the editor who put me on it. This is like after the second film. It's right after Empire Strikes Back. And so it wasn't Star Wars as it is now. It was still pretty important. It was still big enough. David Michelinie wrote it. I had done one earlier issue with Archie Goodwin, where Archie wrote a bunch of them early on, and I did one. He would have asked me if I wanted to draw it. I said, sure. So we did one issue with a bounty hunter in it. I'm sure they took that for the movie too, but I don't know. I have no idea. We did a bounty hunter who turned out to be half cyborg. Oh, spoiler alert, sorry. Half cyborg, half real. I ended up drawing the book. Tom Palmer did the finishes. I don't know if I was doing layouts or tight pencils. I don't remember now. Some were tight. I got loose as it went along. Tom is very good at picking up the slack and making it work. And he was the perfect inker for that book because he's really good at hardware. His 7 or 8-year-old son was a giant Star Wars fan. So Tommy would look over his shoulder and make sure that he was drawing all the spaceships correctly.
Licensed books were a big part of Marvel's business plan in the 70s and 80s, and some pros considered them low-rent assignments. That certainly wasn't the case with Star Wars, which was a top seller for years. In 1983, writer Jo Duffy landed the job and would script the series with a few interruptions for its final 3 years. Duffy introduced new threats, such as the Nagai, and embraced the wonderful weirdness of the property.
There were 2 reasons I was able to get the original Marvel Star Wars comic, for both of which I am profoundly grateful. The first is, my older brother Malachi, who was a big science fiction fan, and I stood online the very night the movie opened to see it, and I fell insanely in love with it. So I was always, if you need a Star Wars written, do you need a Star Wars villain? I could do a Star Wars. My co-assistant editors, who were also my co-writers and what have you, but were also my competition, were always convinced that the great future glory lay in doing the core Marvel characters.
At a time when women struggled to get a fair shake in comics, Duffy was part of a group of female creators guiding the Star Wars series. It included artist Cynthia Martin, editor Louise Jones, soon to become Louise Simonson, and writer-editor Ann Nesenti.
It was kind of a dream team because Jo Duffy, she knew her Star Wars history, and Cynthia Martin, she had a different kind of a style. It was more an expressionistic style, and they worked really well as a team. I became Louise Jones, Wheezy's assistant. She trained me. I like to call myself a Wheezy clone because it's like, I just sort of like mimicked her style, and her style was kind of the velvet fist. It's like you thought you were being told wonderful things when you were actually getting punched. Wheezy had this style of making everyone who left the room happy, and then they'd probably pause and go, wait a minute, she just told me to rewrite the whole thing.
So they were like, we'll see you dead before we let you near Spider-Man, honey. But this licensed property, sure, it's never going to amount to anything anyway. When Roy had finished it, and then Archie had finished it, and it turned out Denny thought he would do it, but never really wanted it, I'd been standing there for months going, I could write a villain. I could write 2 villains. How about if I just keep writing villains till you realize that I'm the regular writer on the book? And that was how I got the job.
I think Jo was a Star Wars fan. Cynthia was kind of a new artist looking for something. And there are certain styles of art that aren't necessarily perfect for superheroes. Cynthia and I went on to do a 4-issue Spider-Man series, and we put Peter Parker in an insane asylum. And part of that was because she didn't really want to draw superheroes. So it could be that Star Wars was a place that drew artists that didn't really want to do superheroes.
During the early years, Marvel was given a fairly wide berth to dream up stories. As time went on and The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi cemented Star Wars as Hollywood's top franchise, things got more complicated, and the rules got a bit weirder.
In the beginning, the Lucasfilm people were very accepting, and they were like, don't contradict the movies, we'll tell you what not to touch. Beyond that, have at it and go. I could see that my days on the Star Wars title were running to a close when suddenly there were more people at Lucasfilm trying to decide whether or not to approve the comics than there were at Marvel actually doing them. And in the beginning, I know George Lucas read every issue, with which I am still thrilled, because he is the wellspring and the guy and what have you.
What was funny was we had an easy time with Lucasfilms. But whenever Jo would come up with a story and I would get a letter from George Lucas, who probably wasn't George Lucas, it was one of his minions, it was like, no, you cannot do this thing.
It wasn't Star Wars. The organ comes up behind you and the reverberation. It was fun to do, and it was also a time when the Lucasfilm folks didn't say too much about what you were doing.
At some point, suddenly there were people I'd never heard of, all of them incredibly nice, but saying things like, we don't know whether we can allow this or not because we don't know yet whether it's going to contradict something we haven't come up with yet.
One of the odd things about the time I was on the book, we had several restrictions, which I understood, but they were still, it was interesting when you do a comic like that. One is, we could never have our hero and Darth Vader meet. So Luke and Darth Vader could never come face to face. We couldn't use one of the heroes because Han Solo was in carbonite from the second film.
Sure enough, like some of the stuff that they didn't let us do ended up in movies. And we're kind of like, well, were they already developing that? Jo created something that was kind of like the Death Star, and she also did this prequel Jedi training school stuff. So, we never really knew. In hindsight, you can go either way. They were already developing it, or they went, gee, that Jo Duffy had a good idea. Let's stop the comic and put it in the movie.
We couldn't have a romance between Luke and Leia. They didn't tell us why. I didn't guess on that one, I must say. But what it ended up meaning was that you had your main hero and your main heroine, like nothing could be going on between them. I will say, I thought David finessed it beautifully with the stories he told. I thought we had a pretty good run in the book without that stuff being obvious. You don't want the restrictions to be obvious, and I thought they worked out pretty well.
Simonson recalls one story idea that writer David Michelinie had that Lucasfilm vetoed for reasons that would soon become quite obvious.
His first idea for a first real story, the one we did was 51, the first issue we did, Star Wars 51, was the Empire is going to build a new Death Star, and they're going to put chicken wire over the exhaust ports. And the Lucasfilm people got back to us on the plot and said, can't do that. Can't tell you why not, but you can't do it. We said, oh, I get it, movie 3. So we figured out what that was about. But then we said, well, how about if I draw, or David said this, we'll draw a giant cannon floating in space with a concave cannon in the front of it, but it won't be spherical. They said, okay, that's fine. So we did Death Star story. We just didn't do it with a round Death Star. And my favorite part is that David called it the Tarkin, which I thought was a great name for this giant device, which we probably blew up, I don't remember now.
Simonson's artwork from his Star Wars days has been collected in IDW's Artist Edition series to give fans a sense of the detail he and inker Tom Palmer put on each page.
So this is an Artist Edition. For those of you who don't know, what we do is we scan the original artwork in full color. You can see the stamp was in color. If there are corrections on the art, Tom didn't do that many corrections, I guess, so it's hard to find them. But you'll find whiteout, or you'll find like blue line like this. This wouldn't show up in the actual print, but it gives you a look at the artwork as close as you can get to the art without actually holding the art in your hands. It's a facsimile of the way the art looks. I like the work. I think David wrote great stories. Tom did a beautiful job finishing it. And I thought we told some pretty good stories.
By 1986, the Star Warriors were barely hanging on. Sales of the comic had faded as fans outgrew their Jedi obsession and moved on. Marvel finally pulled the plug on the series right in the middle of a multi-part story Duffy was plotting. The final issue provided an abrupt and unsatisfying end to a landmark series.
Issue 107 was part of a big multi-chapter epic that was going to run at least a year or two, and suddenly they said, no, we'll tell you what. You've already finished this issue, but we'll let you redo the last 7 pages. Give us a conclusion. And we didn't know when we did 107 we'd redo the end of it to make it the end of the Marvel Star Wars for all those years. I do recall the editor told me, I had to tell Cindy Martin, who was my artist, and Cindy has a great sense of humor and is a great realist, and I just walked up to her drawing table and said, Cindy, Star Wars is on the roof and we can't get it down. And I don't know if you know, it's a terrible old joke, but she got the reference and we went out on laughter instead of tears.
Despite the disappointing finish, Duffy remains proud of her contributions to the Star Wars mythos, including some elements that may or may not have inspired future Star Wars movies.
It was a dream come true, and I want to say for the record, because I get a lot of people going, oh, well, your work's not canonical. Yeah, well, according to George Lucas, when I was doing the work, it was too, and that was why they kept such a tight rein on us in my last few issues. It was the reason I never got to touch Darth Vader. It was the reason we could only do certain things with the Force, because the Marvel comics were absolutely intended to be canon when we were doing them, and therefore anything I did automatically became part of their canon if they chose to use it. And let's face it, there are things in the movie I have literally seen that I know came out of my comics, and things I've seen that are like, okay, you changed the name, but you know perfectly well that we know perfectly well we did this. And the water planet in The Phantom Menace, I was and sort of still am rather obsessed with aquariums and aquaria, and I was at Coney Island at their aquarium thinking, but from the fish's standpoint, maybe I'm the one in the protective enclosure, and that's the world. And that was the beginning of the planet Iskalon.
It's hard to recall now, given the ever-present nature of the franchise, but there was a time in the late 1980s when Star Wars was essentially dead. Marvel had also canceled the kid-friendly droids and Ewoks titles and wasn't interested in doing more Star Wars comics. That gave writer Tom Veitch and artist Cam Kennedy an idea.
What happened is Cam Kennedy was doing a gorgeous space opera for the Epic line, and George Lucas saw that And he came forward and said, you know, this makes me want to do Star Wars again. But they took the license to Lucasfilm, but they took Cam Kennedy, and I think it was Tom Veitch was the writer, but I can't swear to that because frankly, I have not been at all good, which is to say completely atrocious, about reading anybody's Star Wars comics after my own because I still wish I was doing them.
In 1991, the pair debuted Dark Empire for Dark Horse Comics. That comic quite simply brought Star Wars back to life. During its more than 2 decades as caretaker of the Star Wars license, Dark Horse produced dozens of comics full of Jedis, Sith Lords, and various scum and villainy. Series like Tales of the Jedi gave fans their first glimpse of the earliest days of the Jedi Order. The company even reprinted these Star Wars newspaper strips and the original Marvel series. But when Disney bought Marvel in 2009, and then Lucasfilm in 2012, the writing was on the wall. It wasn't if Dark Horse would lose the license, but when. In 2015, Marvel would launch its first new Star Wars comic in 20 years. And just like that first Star Wars comic from 1977, this one broke all kinds of sales records. Star Wars #1 by Jason Aaron and John Cassidy sold more than 1 million copies, thanks to lots and lots of variants. For most of today's biggest comics creators who grew up as fans of the original movies, getting the chance to tell stories in the original trilogy era has proven irresistible. Ask Kieron Gillen, whose Darth Vader series is a certified modern masterpiece.
My main memory of writing Darth Vader is me lying in bed in the morning when I was doing a Darth Vader script, just dreaming up a way for Darth Vader to kill somebody, and then running down excitedly like a child to type out, like, and then he can do this thing when he throws the lightsaber, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, writing Luke and Leia and Han is like, oh, you're just writing them. They're very natural voices because you kind of know them. I mean, I've said this before, but like the first movie I ever saw in the cinema was Empire. So the weirdest thing about writing this period of Star Wars is I'm basically writing the prequel to my own entry into fandom. So it's like, if that kind of Grant Morrison loop in time, that's kind of it. And that should blow my mind, and it doesn't.
Gillen can also take credit for co-creating one of the best additions to the Star Wars canon in years, Dr. Aphra.
She seems to have grown over the years. This year's Celebration, there was a lot of Dr. Aphra cosplay. There's always been some, but Celebration clearly has a lot of her. And it's weird, of course, when I was writing her and dropping into Vader, I was quite nervous, because it's that kind of people come to Star Wars books to, like, you know, they want to read Luke, Leia, Han, Vader, you know, and putting your own character in there felt presumptuous. I was kind of like very aware she was a supporting actor, and she was invented as a supporting actor because Vader can't speak too much. So you need someone by Vader to do all the talking. And she was kind of like that surrogate Han in the dynamic. Star Wars is interesting because they're very pure archetypes. And that's like when you look at them and you think, you know, that Luke Vader is the farm boy who is, you know, with this great destiny, and Leia is this like princess of a fallen realm, you know, and Luke, and Han, full-on scoundrel, you know. These are really full-on things. And with Dr. Aphra, it's like, what other archetypes work well? And Aphra's, oh, you know, archaeologist. You know, adventure archaeologist, but evil. Especially in the period we did, the canon was like changed. As a character who could metaphorically unearth the past was really interesting. And that's what I think that's just one reason why I think Dr. Aphra works. Absolutely iconic in her own way, but not, you know, but also fits in that way.
Lucasfilm understandably maintains control over the stories. They've got movies, television, and video games to worry about, after all. But Marvel editor-in-chief C.B. Cebulski says creators get a much longer leash than one might expect.
We work very closely hand in hand with Lucasfilm, but we're just thrilled with the amount of leeway they give us. They came to Marvel and we came up with the plan to put the Star Wars universe together under our auspices, and they knew the fact that we're the best at what we do. They gave us a lot of freedom in the people we choose, and we internally, with original editor Jordan White and now with editor Mark Panisha, who's taken over the line the last couple of years, worked to make sure that these guys are Star Wars fans, that they know the ins and outs. We have a very good editorial team who've seen all the movies, read all the books, read all the novels, know everything there possibly is to know about Star Wars, and working in conjunction with Lucasfilm. I'm really proud of the fact that when the creative teams have changed on a lot of our books, when the torch has been passed from one writer or one artist to the other, it's been almost seamless, and the stories have just had such great personality and really adding to that Star Wars mythos.
Delilah Dawson is a well-known author in the Star Wars universe. She scripted the acclaimed novel Phasma, as well as the recent Galaxy's Edge Black Spire book, based on the Disney Parks attraction. She's also written stories for the all-ages anthology comic series Star Wars Adventures. And like most people who make their living doing something Star Wars related, Dawson is also a big fan.
I really like the way things are happening now in the new canon. There's a new sense of hope and of playfulness. For a while, there was a lot of seriousness.
For writers, the challenge is always in trying to come up with something that hasn't been done before. For Dawson, that meant doing a Jar Jar and Padme team-up, or the very first Rose Tico comic story.
basically they say to me, they kind of float, would you like to do a Padme and Jar Jar story? And I'm like, yes, Misa in all the way. And then we talk about, how many pages, what we want to accomplish. I send like 3 little pitches for the story. They choose the one we want, we elaborate. The only one where I came close to going to them was when I got to do the first Rose Tico story for number 6. At the time, I was the only female writer who had read the script for The Last Jedi, so I was the only person who knew who Rose Tico was at all. So I really looked into that. But we kept talking, and I kept saying like, but what if we wrote a Porg story, but we really need a Porg story? What about Porgs? And I think they got so sick of it that they gave me 6 pages to write a David Attenborough-esque history of Porgs with some Porg biology and biography. So that was more like begging as compared to pitching, though.
To me, the job is to do Star Wars in new and interesting ways, but have that fundamental, like, the vibe of it. The thing with Vader was, okay, I want it to feel like Star Wars, but with Vader as the protagonist. I could have done an Imperial book, but that would have been really grey and cold and fascist and boring. What I did is I sort of inverted the Star Wars dynamic. So it's like, it's Star Wars, but it's, a really dark Star Wars. Vader kind of acts as surrogate Luke, as in, this man on a quest. And he just goes about it in a very different way, normally involving Force jokes.
It's incredible to get to contribute any canon. I mean, I've been all in for Star Wars since I threw up on my episode 1 sheets back in the, early 80s. Wish my mom hadn't thrown those out. We could have washed them. But yeah, I still have my Ewoks, I am all in. So it's really incredible to be able to contribute anything. And also, they have a habit of tapping me to write strong women, which is amazing. Leia was, one of the first real heroines I saw as a kid, seeing myself reflected in the science fiction and fantasy movies and stories I love so much, as well as Sindel from the Ewok Adventure. Holdo especially, I loved her in the movie, and then I got to read Leia, Princess of Alderaan by Claudia Gray, and really saw what a complex, interesting, wacky character Holdo is, and I connected with that. So getting to write her and young Leia was really fun, and if you read Star Wars Adventures number 25, there are kind of like 2 little Easter eggs in there. One of them is that I asked people on Twitter what they would like to see in Star Wars stories that they hadn't seen before. Got a ton of answers, but one of them, somebody said, oh, we haven't seen a Zeltron in a while, so I put in a Zeltron. And also, you will see, it's a secret, there's Elan Sleaze Bagano from Attack of the Clones. I managed to sneak him into that story. So if you read number 25 and you look carefully, you will see he did indeed go home and rethink his life.
When Disney bought Lucasfilm, the Star Wars expanded universe was essentially killed. Anything published before April 2014 is no longer considered canon, only legends. Disappointing? Sure. But that doesn't make all those wild and woolly early Marvel tales and the ambitious stories of the Dark Horse years any less awesome. And now, we're in a new golden age of Star Wars comics. Marvel is rebooting its Star Wars line to focus on the period immediately following The Empire Strikes Back. For fans who want to know more about some of the new trilogy's characters, books like The Rise of Kylo Ren will tackle that assignment, which is to say, if you like Star Wars comics, you've got lots of choices. How long this new golden age lasts is anyone's guess, but with TV shows like The Mandalorian opening new portals into the universe, we bet it lasts a little while longer. What's your favorite Star Wars comic book issue or story arc? Doesn't matter the publisher. Let us know in the comments.
Hope you enjoyed this week's Behind the Panel. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, that's right, hit it, to get more awesome comic book videos. And remember to check out my weekly column on SYFYWire.com. And listen to the Behind the Panel podcast. It's an audio documentary series all about comics and the men and women who create them. Be sure to subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts.